Welcome to another coding tutorial, and in today's video, I'm going to show you how to make a pixelated kaleidoscope. I loved playing with a kaleidoscope when I was a kid, but who am I kidding? I still do love it now. It is super cool to look through this cubic-shaped toy that creates mesmerizing, symmetrical, repeating patterns. Also, did you know that the name kaleidoscope comes from Greek words kalos means beautiful, eidos means form, and scope means to look or to examine. So let's make this beautifully formed looking instrument with code. There are actually many p5.js tutorials out there that make beautiful kaleidoscope sketches, but most of them use the transformation technique with functions such as transform, rotate, and scale. And so I thought that I would approach it a little bit differently by making a pixelated kaleidoscope with a 2D grid so that we can get some 2D arrays practice in. We're going to start by creating a few variables, starting with columns, rows, and size. And then how about we set size to 10? And then we're going to create an array called grid, and this is going to be a 2D array. So first in size setup, I'm going to start by calculating what columns and rows are. So columns is going to be width divided by size, and then rows will be height divided by size. And then we're going to create a 2D array using a nested for loop that goes from I equals to 0 to I less than columns, I plus plus, and then the inner loop will be j equals to 0 to j less than rows, and then j plus plus. To create a 2D array, inside this outer loop, we're going to start by populating the array with empty 1D arrays. And then inside this inner loop, we're going to populate it with data, some type of data. And I'm going to actually put 255. So the grid 2D array will be actually storing color information. Then now, inside the draw function, what we're going to do is that we're going to use a nested for loop, the same exact loop. So j less than rows, and then j plus plus. I want to start by just drawing out a grid with a specific number of rows and columns. So we're going to draw rectangles, and a rect function takes in a total of 4 arguments. The first 2 are the x and y coordinates of the top left corner of the rectangle, and then the third and the fourth are going to be the size. So it's going to be I times size, and then j times size, and then size and size. And then if I click run, we do get a grid, but I actually also want to use the fill function to fill the color. And what is going to be the color? It's going to be the information that we store inside the grid 2D array. So grid of I and j. And actually, instead of white here, how about we change it to red so that you can see that it actually fill this color. Perfect. All right, I'm gonna set it back to white. Now I want to be able to create a pattern on this grid using the mouse location. So first we're going to, how about set x and y location based on the mouse location. So let's set x equals to mouse x, and then y equals to mouse y. And then why don't we just print x and y out? So nothing surprising. You can see that where the mouse is, it just print out the location of the x and y location of that mouse, right? So we have it from 0 to the size of the width and 0 to the size of the height. But what we want to do is that we actually want the values that are index values. So instead of just doing mouse x and mouse y, I'm going to also divide it by size. And then now we have it between 0 and 40, right? Because the size is 10, and then columns and rows are between 0 and 39, basically. And because index values have to be integers, what we also need is to put the function called floor, and floor basically rounds the number to the closest integer, round it down. So let's put in floor. And then now we get the values between 0 and 39. Perfect. Now, what we want to do next is that we want to set the value inside the grid at X and Y index to be equals to, how about a color red? And if I click run, you can see that now we can paint the grid based on our mouse location. Now let's put some more conditions. So how about we put in if mouse is pressed, and this is a built-in Boolean variable inside P5 where when you press your mouse, then this value turns true, and then that's when we want it to actually execute this command. So I'm not pressing my mouse, nothing happens, and then I press my mouse, and then we can draw. But then now it gives us an error, and because I press my mouse outside of the canvas, and it gives us an error because the grid only have index values between 0 and 39, right? And because I click my mouse outside of the sketch, then the values is outside of 0 to 39, so it gives us an error. So we need an additional condition. So we're gonna say if mouse X is greater than 0 and mouse X is less than width and mouse Y is greater than 0 and mouse Y is less than height, right? Then we're gonna put all of these conditions inside. All right, let's click run. And then now I press my mouse, and even if I press my mouse outside of the canvas, it's okay, no errors, and that is because it is outside this condition now. Then now it works. But this is not a kaleidoscope, right? Because we're just basically drawing on the canvas. So what we want to do is, let me actually change from 10 to how about 100? All right, so now we have a total of 4 columns and 4 rows. So if I click this cell here at index 0, 0, what I want is that I want this one, and this one, right? This, and this to also activate. And so what we need to do is that we need to figure out at index X and Y, what are those corresponding cells. So what we need is X, Y, and then columns -1 minus X, Y, X, rows -1 minus Y, and then this one is columns -1 minus X and rows -1 minus Y. All right, so that's what we're gonna do. So inside this conditional statements, what we're gonna say is that we have X and Y already, right? And so we need to create 4, how about vectors? And vector is an object that can hold 2 values, and I'm gonna use it to hold the X and Y coordinates. So I'm going to actually call it, how about cell 1 to be equals to create vector. And create vector is a method inside a vector class for us to create a vector. And we just want it to be holding X and Y values. And then for cell 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, and 4, right? What we need is, let's start with this one, which is going to be columns -1 minus X, Y. And then how about this is the third one? Let's do X, rows -1 minus Y, right? And then this last one is going to just be columns -1 minus X, same as this, and then this one is rows -1 minus Y. Perfect. And then we also need to do this for the grid. And instead of just putting X and Y here, we're going to extract the values inside of the vector here. And so we need to do cell1.x and cell1.y and do the same thing for the rest here. 2, 3, and 4. Then let's change the number. 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4. All right, and then how about we go back to a size of 10. Then let's try it. Ta-da! now we have a mirror image just like a kaleidoscope. And I'm doing this with a very specific pattern with just 2 mirror image around the X and Y axis, right? What if you want to try it with the different kinds of folds, maybe 8 folds or something like that? All you need is just to calculate what these locations would be. All right, so now we have this beautiful image here. The last part is that I want to change the colors out. So instead of using the RGB mode, which is the mode that we're using right now, where we provide red, green, and blue values, I'm going to change the color mode to a mode called HSB. That stands for hue, saturation, and brightness. And this is a very easy way for us to create rainbow colors. The first argument, hue, ranges between 0 and 360, and it's basically the color on a color wheel that goes from red to red. The second and third argument, saturation and brightness, range between 0 and 100. Saturation tells you how intense that particular hue is, and then brightness tells you how bright the color is. So we're going to start by creating a value C for color, set it to 0. And now instead of just putting grid here, what we're going to do is that we're going to have to also provide the second and the third arguments for saturation and brightness, which I'm going to set at 100. So I want it to be at peak saturation and also brightness. And also, instead of color being red here, we're going to set it to C. And then if I click run, it is still just red because we're not changing this value at all, right? So how about we set a conditional statement that if C is less than 360, and as I mentioned, right, that wheel ranges between 0 and 360, then we want to increment up by 1, and then else we reset it back to 0. Let's try that. And then now we get a nice rainbow color. And how about we also set the background instead of white to maybe like a dark blue color. And then now we can see the rainbow a lot easier. Yay. Okay, so this is an interactive kaleidoscope sketch, but next I want to do a more generative one. So this is a duplicated sketch from what we just did previously. So first we're going to create a few variables. Let's start with how about X and Y, and then inside setup I'm going to set X to be equals to just a random value. Let's do 5 and 5. These are going to be the starting X and Y index. We're not going to make it interactive with the mouse anymore, so I'm going to delete those conditional statements. But what we're going to do is, instead of setting it equals to this, it's already set to 5, right? So I can delete this as well. But what we're going to do is actually we're going to increment it by a certain amount. So how about we do 1 and 1? And then let's just try this. And we got an error, and it is the same error that we dealt with previously, right? Which is where the locations of the index are outside of the grid. So what I want to do is, first, instead of setting 1 and 1 here, we're going to create a variable called dx and dy to be the change of in the x location and then the y location. And so it's going to be, how about we set it to be equals to 1 here and 1 here. But then we want to also use a conditional statement that says if x plus dx is less than 0, so if it's outside of the grid, right? Or x plus dx is greater than columns, right? So these are index values, right? So it's not width, it's columns. Then we want to set dx to be equal to 0. We don't want it to move any further. And then we're going to do it the same for the y direction. So y plus dy is greater than rows. Then we're going to set dy to be equal to 0. And then let's try that. Oops. Oh, this has to be -1, right? Because remember when we did 0 to 39, it has to be 39, not 40. So let's try that. Okay, yay. And we get this cross image. But now it doesn't actually bounce back or anything like that. But what I'm actually going to do is, instead of setting a constant value for dx and dy to be equals to 1, what I want to do is I want it to change based on a random value. So let's do dx to be equals to a random value. But what random value? I want it to be a random value between these values, -2, -1, 1, and 2. So usually I would have done it doing just a random value between -2 and 2, right? But the reason that I want it to be in this case is so that it only picks these 4 values, and I can do that by putting the values that I want it to randomize inside an array. And I'm going to do the same thing for dy. So how about I print out what dx and dy is? And then you can see that these are the only values that are being picked out. And we get this generative pattern here, which is quite beautiful. All right, so I'm going to actually set this to be 5 so that we have a little bit more room to play with. And I also actually want the starting point to not be set at a constant 5 for both x and y, but I actually want it to be somewhere closer to the middle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this print statement first, and then I'm actually going to randomize between columns divided by 2. So this is the middle point, right? And then I want it to be minus some type of margin, and when we can set what that is. So columns minus 2 divided by 2 also plus margin. And how about we set, let's say, margin to be equals to 5. But this will give us a decimal value, right? It can't give us a decimal value if columns divided by 2 is a decimal value. So just to be safe, we're going to put floor here as well to turn it into an integer. And then we're going to do the same for y. And let's click run. Oops. Line 11. Random. Columns and rows has to be defined here first. And actually this will be rows and not columns. Ta-da! It's really nice. And you can play around with the values that you give random here. If I wanted to actually move a little bit more to in the y direction but not as much in the x direction, what if I change it to just be -1 and 1 on the x direction? Yeah. All right. And then last but not least, I actually have a color palette that I want to use instead of using this rainbow color. So I'm going to actually delete the color mode and use the RGB default mode. And then we don't need the C anymore. And I'm going to declare my color palette, and the palette is going to be this nice pastel colors. And then inside here, so because it's RGB now, I want it to still be dark blue, so it's going to be 0, 0, 100. And C, we need to set what C is, and I want to pick a random value inside this array, and I can just do it easily using a random function, and then put in the name of the array. And we don't need this anymore either. All right, let's try it. Oops. Color palette is not defined. All right, it's 1 L, not 2 L's, and 2 T's. And you don't want 100, 100 here. And ta-da! So this is my take on a pixelated kaleidoscope, and you can create pretty authentic pattern that looks really nice. And yeah, I just loved this color palette so much, and look at that neat design. I hope that you enjoyed this quick video and get a basic of how to use a 2D array and how to generate some random patterns. So give this one a try.